by which we can reduce suffering across the globe. So these are the three key, ethical dimensions that he, along with his team in the York and other parts of the globe, that try to think through these ideas very seriously. And also, this is being used by WHO as a kind of ethical guideline for collaborative research and this. And because this is important, when we now, you just a few minutes back, you were saying that there are things that we need to observe, we need to do. He has a clear understanding of how things are happening across the globe because of his very vast experiences of dealing with diseases, dealing with health problems, health issues across the globe, that he has a clear perspective on how to go about with dealing with this situation that we are in. So that makes his presence, his talk, his insights more, we need to remain drawn to these ideas for a long time, definitely beyond this talk, because this will give us a clear idea of how to understand these health emergencies, how WHO has 4 strategies historically to deal with situation, and what COVID-19, in what way COVID-19 is a different situation, and what can best be done. And nobody can be the best counselor at this moment than Sanjoy Bhattacharya in terms of how to do research, how to deal with governance strategies, something. That's why he's, in fact, look at the kind of ideas that he, in fact, floated in terms of thinking about Global Health History Center. And he's based in New York, where he co-founded, he is co-directing and also founded this center, Global Health Histories, Center for Global Health Histories, which is basically a kind of, idea which came from WHO because of, perhaps, I don't know, but Sanjoy must have been very instrumental in, developing this idea. And he's also himself the director of WHO's Global Health Histories Collaborating Centers. So, and he has immense presence in terms of his, association with different universities and institutions in India. And that makes Sanjoy Bhattacharya really unique for this moment and for this situation that we are in. And I don't need to talk about him more, and I don't want to stand between him and all of us at the moment. And we need to, I'm sure that his talk and his insights today, which is going to share with us, will help us immensely to think differently about this situation, particularly when we represent the academy and we have sense of histories, and we are doing social science and we are doing histories. How do we understand the history of diseases? How do we understand the history of healthcare, and how we can use these experiences as a kind of base to look forward to a new future. Thank you very much.
So shall I now start?
Yeah.
Okay. So can Manish put the PowerPoint up, please?
Yes, I'll just in a minute.
So, yeah.
Yes. Sorry.
Thank you. Okay. So let me first start by thanking all of you, Professor Nanda, Professor Mishra, for generously hosting me. I think I would just add one thing to what my dear friend Chandi just said. We are connected through a treasure, a treasure that was, sadly, because he has passed on. We are connected through Professor Bipin Chandra, who taught both of us, and has been a very important guiding light, along with many other JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University teachers, as we have journeyed through our experience with the discipline of history. So I think for both Chandi and me, Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi has been foundational. There is not one day in my life when I don't think about the Center for Historical Studies in JNU and remember the amount that I learned. And as Chandi says, I've innovated, yes. I've challenged. I've never agreed to stick to a model. But that willingness to experiment, I think, came due to the Center of Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, where this was actively encouraged. So there's a lesson there as well, that if your teachers encourage you to innovate, then the students, as they become part of the academic structures, they then pass on that message of innovation to those they work with. So thank you very much for having me today. Now, the opening slide is intended to do two things. The first image is an image of a girl in India who had contracted variola major, which was the more virulent, more dangerous form of smallpox that really harmed those who got the infection. So I want you to note the virulence of the disease, the damage caused by the disease. It's when you look at an image like this that you realize what a danger it was and why it was so feared in its variola major form whenever it struck people, because the death rate could be more than half, sometimes up to 75%. There's an even more dangerous form of smallpox, which was called hemorrhagic smallpox, which thankfully was rare, but when that hit, 100% of people would die. So this was not a joke. I want you to realize that there are similarities and differences. In terms of COVID, people are very fearful of COVID. They're thinking about COVID all the time, the unseen danger, who might infect us. That way, the fear levels, I suppose, between COVID and smallpox were similar. But there is also dissimilarity, and that dissimilarity is that someone who catches COVID and falls ill does not display these lesions, does not display these pustular lesions that indicate that they're infective of smallpox. So which also means that the disease response has to be slightly different. One is a more visible disease and one is a less visible disease. And the current fear about COVID, I think, comes from the fact that we actually know very little about it. So the mystery of COVID is something that is stoking fear worldwide. The second slide, the second image on this slide that I want you to look at is the normal, sort of most common, the most widely known. Yeah, thank you. This second image is the sort of most widely used a historical, non-historical explanation of how smallpox was eradicated, which was basically very simple. The argument was that in 1796, Edward Jenner created the world's first smallpox vaccine. That vaccine, or that idea of vaccination, then allows in 1967 for the World Health Organization to push for eradication efforts. And basically, after about slightly more than a decade of organized vaccination, the World Health Organization in 1980 is able to declare smallpox eradicated. So, so this year, 2020, is actually the 40th anniversary of smallpox eradication, which is why I thought all of you might want to listen to this. So, I refer to my talk as an alternative commemoration. The second image on this slide represents the sort of bog standard, not very historical, slightly propaganda-esque commemoration of smallpox eradication. And this is basically, the second image is what I'm going to be challenging, both descriptively but also conceptually, during my talk today. Now, the WHO was deeply connected to the smallpox eradication program. Okay? So it is very important that before we go into a history of smallpox eradication, we also sort of have a short potted discussion about what the World Health Organization is. Now, if one adapts or adopts, adapting is good, adopting is less good, but if one adopts a Eurocentric notion of history, which many historians do, the WHO is basically Mark II of the League of Nations Health Organization that existed in the interwar years. I argue to you, I submit to all of you online today, that the WHO was actually something much more. The WHO was not just a larger version of the League of Nations and its health section. The World Health Organization was an entity that was discussed immediately after the Second World War in a major international conference in America, in San Francisco, where the decision to create a new health organization was taken. And the aim of that health organization was not just to copy what the League of Nations did, but to create a new agency, a new organization for a new world that had been ravaged terribly by a world war that had killed millions of people. So this health organization, was to help with the reconstruction, the rebuilding of the world, but also help develop new ideas of inclusive health, the idea of health for all, that everyone deserved good health, came out of a post-Second World War scenario where people were basically tiring of major conflict. But more importantly, I submit to you, the World Health Organization is also deeply influenced in character, in its aims, in what develops on the ground. It is deeply influenced by decolonization that happens after the Second World War. So it is not an accident that countries like India, Egypt, Indonesia, which become not just independent, but also internationally assertive, play a very, very important role in both the birth and the expansion of the World Health Organization. So then this leads us to the question, what is the World Health Organization? So for many people, the World Health Organization is its headquarters in Geneva. Now, if as good historians, we go back to the papers of 1946, 47, and 48, the founders of the WHO, from the very outset, are talking about a decentralized organization, not a centralized organization. The Geneva headquarters was supposed to be the technical nerve center for a very complex organization. And from the very beginning, the newly decolonized nation states had made it very clear that they needed to be able to play an important management role in the new WHO, because they did not want the old European colonial powers to dominate their health related decision making. Therefore, it is not an accident that the World Health Organization's regional office for Southeast Asia was the first one to be formed in New Delhi, in India, because the first Indian government whose picture I have put forth, demanded it. This was one of the major political aims, to make sure that India had the first regional office. And the only woman in this cabinet, as you're looking at this on your screens, second to the right, sitting down, is Rajkumari Amrit Kaur. Very, very important figure, frequently downplayed in Eurocentric histories or US-centric histories. She was the driving force, along with Jawaharlal Nehru, pushing for the creation of not just a regional office, but I argue a very, very powerful regional office that completely redefines the way WHO's role is imagined both in Asia and Africa. And in this regard, there are some extremely important actors who are active in the Eastern Mediterranean Regional Office of the WHO, which is then based in Alexandria. It is now based in Cairo. And these Egyptian figures ally with India, with figures like Amrit Kaur, to create a political network that assists nationalist movements within the WHO regions to embed ideas of good health, universal access to health, primary health care within very positive nationalisms that are trying to get rid of enduring colonialism in the continent of Africa. Here you have to remember that there is an African regional office. That African regional office is in a continent which is still under colonial yoke, dominated by many European colonial officers. So if you can imagine a true two-pronged sort of WHO activity, where the colonial administrations in Africa continue to work with the WHO regional office in Africa, but the nationalist movements that were trying to come up with their own ideas of what their nations would look like in relation to health after decolonization would often work with thinkers in the WHO Southeast Asia Regional Office and the WHO Eastern Mediterranean Regional Office, where internationalism and international collaboration were key. So here, figures like Amrit Kaur, Jawaharlal Nehru were absolutely central, absolutely key. We must remember that Jawaharlal Nehru was not just the first Prime Minister of India. Jawaharlal Nehru was also the first Foreign Minister of India. He was a Prime Minister who wanted to remain in control of foreign relations. And Amrit Kaur was not just a health minister, she was also someone who was empowered by Nehru to go and play a very muscular role in the new multilateral international architecture that was coming up in development and health at the UN level, but also at the WHO level. So this is something we have to remember. Unless we have a complex understanding of what the WHO is, we cannot have a complex understanding of any of its whole health programs that it's involved in. Because if you have a narrow US-centric, Eurocentric definition of WHO, I will argue to all of you as this talk goes on, then you miss out some major actors from the low and middle income countries and decolonizing territories like Amrit Kaur. It's only when you are self-confidently democratic can you create a democratic history. Without that self-confident democracy, your history will always be limited to the history of a few usually great men and usually great white men. And I think the time has long passed when that narrative of heroes, and usually heroes from Europe and America, need to be challenged. Because otherwise, I will argue to you that policy relevant history is impossible because um policy relevant history is all about understanding context. If you don't understand context and if you don't write a history that accommodates multiple voices and multiple experiences, that history cannot then inform future policy. Because without that context, let's say in the state of Orissa, unless officials in the WHO sitting in Delhi and Geneva understand the specific context of Orissa, they can actually not do very much in Orissa because they're operating with a range of simplistic assumptions that can actually not make difference on the ground. That is what I'm going to argue. So the other simplistic sort of narrative that we come across in sort of not very historically complex, not very historically sophisticated narratives of smallpox eradication is that there was a good vaccine, and because there was a good vaccine, there was eradication. As if, a bottle of vaccine produced in the millions is just enough. Okay? It is true that by the 1960s, there were huge stocks of freeze-dried and heat-stable vaccines, and these became available through international agreements and bilateral agreements. India, for example, in the late 1950s, started getting millions of these vaccines from the Soviet Union as part of bilateral agreements. Okay? Now, that is true that a good vaccine that works, is an important determinant. But what I'm going to argue to all of you is that it is not the only determinant. What I'm going to argue to you is the hand that holds the vaccine or takes the vaccine to the people is as important, if not more important, than the vaccine itself. So you cannot just produce a preventive, you cannot just produce a pharmacological sort of product that treats disease. You also have to plan, you also have to think very carefully about the humans who will take this technology to society and introduce it to society properly, but also humanely. If that is not planned, I will argue, then the prospect of resistance and technological failure becomes acute. And history shows us that too. Now, why is the availability of a heat-stable vaccine very important? The availability of a heat-stable vaccine, very important in a country like India, was because many villages in India still do not have reliable electrification. When you don't have reliable electrification, non-freeze-dried vaccines that require refrigeration often are not stored properly and they don't work properly. And vaccination, at least in its initial forms in the 40s and 50s, was a painful operation. And therefore, if you went into a village, vaccinated a lot of children, and then that vaccination was not effective, then you had a situation where parents would say, you've done it once, it hurt my child, the vaccination didn't help us, you've now come back for a second vaccination. No, we will not give you permission again. This is happening again and again. But what a freeze-dried vaccine meant was you did not need fridges anymore. You just needed to store them carefully away from the direct sunlight so that they would not lose their potency, that the vaccination would still work. Now, what is fascinating about the history of this freeze-dried vaccine was that it was successfully tested in the USSR, in the Soviet Union, and also East Pakistan by Soviet and US officials, respectively. So, what is fascinating is that there is, like there is today, a race for a vaccine. Just as there is a race today for a COVID vaccine, there was a race then for an effective freeze-dried smallpox vaccine, with both the United States and the Soviet Union trying to come up with separate products that would work better than the other one, because they quickly realized that an effective smallpox vaccine would be a very effective foreign policy tool, because if you offered a country that was affected with smallpox, effective smallpox vaccine that didn't need refrigeration, that worked as soon as it was used, then that would create goodwill for that particular aid giver, that particular political system. So health is often a very, very important policy tool, a foreign policy tool. And this is something I would like to argue to you that we must always keep in mind. It's not just about goodness and about voluntary humanitarianism. These are terms that are often used. So anyone who argues that, we must stop funding the WHO now because the WHO is political, is missing the point. International health, that is an international organization involved in health or an international alliance involved in health, meaning multiple countries working together to promote health, reduce disease, there is always political negotiation. Politics was always part of international health. Now, what is also fascinating is that countries like India or Pakistan or Brazil, Yugoslavia, these are all countries that very quickly argue that we don't just want vaccine, we want the vaccine technology. And they would use these Cold War tensions to their advantage, often play off America versus the Soviet Union to get the best possible deal. And India got vaccine technology and money and manpower to help them develop a vaccine institute that produced freeze-dried vaccine in Belgaum, which is now in Karnataka, if I'm not mistaken. Belgaum often had a vaccine institute even in British times, but a new wing was created to produce freeze-dried vaccine with Soviet assistance in India. And similarly, Pakistan got assistance from the United States to create one vaccine, freeze-dried vaccine production factory in Dhaka and another one in Lahore. So again, the smallpox story tells us that it's not just aid is not a simple thing. Aid is not just about hegemony. Aim is hegemony, but the people receiving aid can also use the political opportunities in these interactions to get more than what the aid giver was initially planning to give them. In this case, USA and Soviet Union just wanted to give bottles of vaccine, vials of vaccine to people. What happens is that, yes, the vials of vaccine were taken as aid, but countries like India and Pakistan said, we want vaccine production technology as well. We want self-reliance. And self-reliance is always, I think, an important consideration for low and middle income countries, because it gives you technical independence from countries that might otherwise misuse political relations. From that perspective, I can understand what the ICMR is currently trying to do, that it is trying to make sure that there's an Indian vaccine candidate for COVID, because that, if that works, that means that India will not have to be dependent on overseas pharma companies and overseas deliveries, which may have to be bought with US dollars and cost the Indian exchequer a lot of money. But equally, if India has a working vaccine and produces it in large quantities, India can then also deploy that vaccine amongst its friends all over the world and improve the sort of political goodwill towards India. So in that sense, India is in a race now. China is trying to make its vaccine, the United Kingdom trying to make its vaccine, the USA is trying to make its vaccine, India is trying to make its vaccine, and other countries are also trying to make their vaccine, because they see both the domestic, the national benefits, but also the international benefits of producing vaccine. So again, there's a similarity between the history of vaccine production during smallpox eradication, during the smallpox eradication program, and what is happening right now. The other thing I want to highlight is that the vaccine and the humans are not the only two major determinants of vaccination. The technology that goes in the hand to introduce a vaccine to the human body is also very important. So here we have a picture of what was called a bifurcated needle, a simple needle. It was basically a sewing needle with its head flattened with a hammer. Okay. Now, what this meant was that this sharp edge of the needle would go into, if you see this picture on the right of on the extreme right, bottom, of a child being vaccinated with the needle, you just had to prick the child a few times with this needle, which had been dipped in the sort of vaccine, which had been mixed with sterilized water to produce the vaccine, and you would vaccinate a child. But before this, technology, simple technology, came into play. What you would often do was to either use something that looked like a knife or something that looked like a spear to make a deep wound in someone's arms as part of the vaccination process. And a deep wound or a deep cut would often create infections. And infections meant future resistance. Whereas when they started using the bifurcated needle, and there were fewer side effects and fewer infections, people became less nervous about using or agreeing to vaccinations. So what I've tried to submit to all of you here is that there are just, if you look at the vaccine, there are three factors at play here. One is the effective heat-resistant vaccine that can be taken into rural areas without refrigeration. Then the human who is trained, who knows the local context, who can negotiate with local communities, and then the instrument that introduces the smallpox vaccine into a human being. So technology, which can be simple and we can often forget about, can also be very important, as exemplified here with the bifurcated needle. Now, the United States Center for Disease Control, which is under attack, clearly under attack, center that works both domestically and internationally. It plays an important regional role in Latin America, but every so often it also goes into international contexts to assist in major programs. And smallpox eradication program was one such program in which the CDC was deeply involved in. Now, there's nothing wrong in saying that the CDC was an important player in the smallpox eradication program. But there is something wrong if that assertion that CDC was an important player then is made into an assertion that it is the only player. So I'm going to argue to all of you that they were not the only players. The CDC officials were not the only players. There were other players too. But let's have a quick look at what the US Centers for Disease Control's narrative of smallpox eradication is. So according to this narrative, the CDC involvement started from the campaign in Western and Central Africa between 1966 and 1970, where it experimented with various types of vaccines, and it experimented with various types of techniques. These techniques and successes, so successful techniques, which are to be attributed to the US CDC, were then taken to East Pakistan and Bangladesh by the US CDC officials between 1967 and 77, and led to a reduction of smallpox. The same narrative also says that CDC then went and worked in India between 1967 and 75 and helped India reduce smallpox. And then this narrative points out that after smallpox disappeared from South Asia, that is West Pakistan, East Pakistan, through Bangladesh and India, the CDC's officials then led the charge in the eastern part of Africa, where there was still smallpox, the last remaining pockets of smallpox in the Horn of Africa between 1975 and 1979. And here I give you a selection of photos of different CDC officials active in South Asia, active in Africa, just to show that they did actually go into the field. They did go into very difficult policy contexts. They were going into places where they had no idea of sort of political and cultural determinants of health or administrative determinants of health, steep learning curves for many brave people spending a lot of time on the ground. At the same time, without disagreeing necessarily with this narrative, because the CDC was indeed involved in all of these contexts, I would also argue to you that such institutional histories are the histories of the few. Because when you open these books, when you study these books, you're only hearing the voices, you're only hearing evidence from the people, the American workers who are represented in some of these photographs. You're not hearing about, let's say, if you look at the photograph on the top in South Asia, where an American field official is presenting something to this child, not sure what he's presenting, maybe a certificate for bravery or helping them find cases of smallpox. But what you often don't hear, in fact, you don't hear in the official CDC histories, is the voices and the contributions about all the Asian men standing behind the American official. And yet, it was those Asian men, and often women, very important role in smallpox eradication, because they would go into every home, talk to the women folk, find out vaccination status, find out smallpox status, if cases had happened. Their voices don't come out. So that's why I argue that institutional histories have a purpose. Institutional histories want to underline the fact, after an eradication or elimination program is successful, how important that institution is. And as that importance of that institution is being described, or a case is being made for these institutions, then only certain voices are given preeminence at the expense of other voices. So you have to be aware of that. You cannot read institutional histories, and it doesn't matter which institution you are studying in relation to any disease program, you cannot read such material uncritically. That's why first thing I tell my PhD students is go beyond the descriptive. The conceptual is as important as the descriptive. And it's only when you think conceptually can you think critically. So this is something I would also suggest to all of you. So how do we then write the histories of the many? How do we shift focus of a major program? You know, smallpox is still the only human disease that has been eradicated till now. Okay? So it's a very important, extremely important case study for institutions, international or national, that had been involved in the smallpox eradication program. How do we then make sure that these histories that are being produced about the smallpox eradication program are democratic, inclusive histories? So I would say that a shift in focus is exceptionally important, and it's exceptionally important at the same time as we shift this focus by making it the histories of the many. So I would argue that when you look at the African case study of smallpox eradication in the 60s, mid 60s, that for every 100 CDC workers, there were many thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of national and local workers implementing smallpox eradication projects on a day-to-day basis, because the international workers would come in and then go out and move, travel. You know, there would be traveling managers, overseers, educators, vaccinators, evaluators. But all this work was also being done by national and local workers on a day-to-day basis, month after month, year after year. So we have to identify. So if you students sitting in Odisha wanted to write a decolonized histories of the many of smallpox eradication in your state, you would have to quickly identify who the actors were in the Odisha health ministry who basically received these international workers who could only come into India when the government of India, the External Affairs Ministry, gives them permission to do that. They would then travel to Cuttack or Bhubaneswar, who would then be accompanied by officials from your state as they went from district to district doing their work. Now, they were not just accompanying as in being good hosts. These officials from your state would would always be educating the international workers about the political, cultural, administrative, and social determinants of health in Odisha, so that these international workers avoided making any cultural mistakes or political mistakes. So these local state level workers are exceptionally important. And what is fascinating is that we do not still have a detailed study of what happened between 1958, when the call for smallpox eradication was made by multiple countries in the World Health Assembly, and 1980 in Odisha state. I mean, there are I've made a few references in my book, but even I haven't studied Odisha in detail. I study other states, and I'm sure those detailed microhistories, which actually are an extremely important part of international global health histories, can be written, because in the official US CDC histories, one gets hardly any mention of the different Indian officials who contributed to increasing US CDC officials' understandings of what was happening on the ground, what was important on the ground, who kept running the programs up for a day-to-day basis. And in that sense, it is sad that there was no commemoration within India itself of the enormous roles played by these state level and central level officials. And I think that is partially explained by the fact that India's last case is in 75, then emergency takes place, and then India is certified smallpox free in 1977 when the new coalition government is in trouble. So I think the political troubles were so high that actually what was a glorious achievement is disregarded because no one wants to talk about the politics of the period all this good work was happening. But we can go beyond the politics. I think identifying who the major actors were in each Indian state, many of them have already died. They're quite old now. It is very, very important that their voices are recorded and highlighted by individual state governments so that the world knows who these state level managers were who made a global success possible. That is where CDC is very good. CDC invests heavily in the preparation of institutional histories, which places them in the center of these global stories. But low and middle income countries do not often realize the power of these histories. And because these histories, state level and national level histories, are not written, what is then created is a narrative of non-existence of expertise, a non-existence of excellence. And that is why state level officials who played important roles in smallpox eradication program in India were then not given the recognition or given future leadership in other international programs. So this is where the link between history and policy comes. History can often be used simplistically as a propaganda tool by high-income countries to say that they are the only experts who are there and should be involved in all global and international programs all over the world, and that there are no experts or very few experts in low and middle income countries. Because look, there's no history about them, no voices, we have no narratives. That is why I'm trying to fire all of you up to now fan out across India, go into every state of India and identify who these local workers are. If you look at my book, Expunging Variola, published in 2006, I did that. But I was one human being traveling from state to state, identifying and talking to people. And I was proud, and some of these people have died. One major Indian figure was Professor Dr. Damodar Bhonsle, sort of Goanese public health practitioner who then went all over Eastern India to help in the smallpox eradication program. I was blessed to have his personal papers, which showed what an important advisory role he was playing at the ground level across Eastern India. We need to uncover more people. Many of these people have hidden archives. They have their personal correspondences. They're also very hurt because they felt ignored. So some don't talk about it because, our own government ignored us. So we as historians have to bring out these many voices. And if we are able to bring out these many voices, then I argue to you, I submit to you that we can have the histories of the many. Now I want to raise another conceptual issue. Okay? Individuals are important. I'm not saying individuals are unimportant and we have to study hundreds in order to come up with a history. You can also, study microhistories. If you manage to find 2 or 3 important figures in Odisha state who managed smallpox eradication in Odisha state, you interview them in detail, they can also be very important. But it is very important to know that all individuals, you and I, everyone, is a complex human being, right? We have private views, we have public views. So as a historian, we have to be very careful about making the person we're interviewing comfortable with us, trust us. Unless we make them trust us, They will not speak freely. They will present, if they don't trust you, they will give you a public facade when they actually feel something very, different. Sometimes, if they're not trusting of you, if they're not comfortable with you, they will often tell you what they think you want to hear, rather than telling us about what actually happened in the past. So the interviewing technique itself has to be nuanced. You have to think about the technique itself. So let me start giving you examples to better explain what I'm saying here. So, the picture in the middle, the man in the black suit, is Havdan Mala. Dr. Havdan Mala was the WHO Director General at the time of the so-called intensified phase of the smallpox eradication program. He, as a young health official, Dr. Niels Brimnes might have spoken to you about him, was a young Danish medical doctor with an interest in epidemiology, tried to come into India and tried to help eliminate TB and was not successful. That changed him forever. He realized that the sort of ground level challenges in India had to be understood. Context had to be understood before health reform could take place or any program could take place. That is why he also developed a lifelong belief in the importance of strengthening health structures, primary health structures on the ground, because he realized from his early TB experiments that unless the health structures on the ground were strong, no major immunization program could be run consistently well, because, traveling international workers and national workers would only stay for a short period of time. They would vaccinate some people and then move on. Highlighted the importance of primary healthcare. Now, what is very striking is that Mahler had very distinct public and private views. His public view during the smallpox eradication program was, wow, what a wonderful program. I support the program 100%. But his private views, if you go into the archives, was that he was actually opposed to vertical elimination programs which only focused on one disease at a time. He felt that investment in smallpox eradication, the large amounts of money going into smallpox eradication, would then weaken budgets that would have allowed the creation of primary healthcare centers. So he was saying one thing in public, feeling another thing in private, and actually he was a powerful man. So he was actually often trying to take money away from smallpox eradication and give it to the people who were trying to help countries develop stronger health systems, stronger primary healthcare centers. So what is, of course, fascinating is that a lot of the money in the sort of late 60s and 70s that is used to eradicate smallpox is Swedish aid money. So it's not coming directly from WHO. It is coming from Sweden to WHO to be redistributed to the world, rather than coming from taxpayer contributions being given to WHO. So these are important things. Then there's a picture of the lady right at the top, black and white picture. That's a picture of Nicole Grasse. She was a Swiss-French official who represented the WHO headquarters in the WHO Southeast Asia regional office based in New Delhi. Now, she was an immensely important figure. She is sadly no longer with us. She has passed on. But she was an important figure who successfully worked around diplomatic structures. She actually developed a very good working relationship with Indira Gandhi, which helped her a lot. But then when you look at US CDC histories, or you look at many of the institutional histories, her name seems to have disappeared. And I don't understand why, because she was a crucial figure. Then if you look at the picture on the right, you see there's an African gentleman and then there's an white American gentleman. That white American gentleman is Donald A. Henderson, who headed the smallpox headquarters program at the WHO headquarters in Geneva. And he too had widely diverging views in public and private. He was an internationalist. He believed in the importance of nations' contributions to their own programs. He would always empower national actors within different countries to run programs. He would provide for training. He would provide for extra funds. He was basically very, very supportive of national level activities. I'll give you a picture of Indira Gandhi here as well. India's Prime Minister's public and private views about smallpox eradication changed as well. She moved from a sort of state of disinterest to supportiveness because people who she was close to were identified by Nicole Grasse as being important ambassadors, bridges. J.R.D. Tata was a very good example. And in fact, what is often forgotten in US-centric or Eurocentric histories is how much money and how many resources the Tatas gave that made eradication of smallpox in India possible. But that history is not written. I think I was the first one in Expunging Variola to highlight the contribution of Tata funds and Tata personnel and health personnel in the eradication program. So this is what happens when you have US and Eurocentric histories. Massive contributions by individuals and organizations get ignored. So I would argue that there are many more million histories in South Asia. Okay? And why is South Asia important? South Asia is important because it was the world's largest reservoir of smallpox, of variola major. It had a long history of vaccination from colonial times till after independence.
बाहर नहीं और 10-15 मिनट भी बाहर भी.
Okay. India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh were therefore crucial to worldwide eradication of smallpox. There were hundreds of thousands of deaths per year in this region, and this was not uncommon. Each state worked with distinct laws and budgets in a federal governance structure. Again, institutional histories tend to suggest that sort of national and subnational smallpox programs were centralized. They were not. For instance, we don't have a detailed understanding of how much money went from Odisha state government into the local smallpox eradication program. I've studied Bengal and Bihar and Rajasthan in detail, Maharashtra as well, and there are significant state level contributions that we need to calculate and bring into the histories of the international, the global smallpox programs history. So what is very striking once you take this approach is that each state worked with distinct laws and budgets, and therefore multiple methods and approaches were always used. And success of smallpox eradication in a context like India or other countries in South Asia was based as much as successful adaptation to diverse contexts. So we are not talking about the top-down imposition of a core idea. What we are talking about is the suggestion of a core idea that comes to India. Workers in different Indian states then tell the people who are suggesting these core ideas that, look, brother, this is not possible, or sister, this is possible, this is not possible, because these are the economic, political, administrative contexts in our states, and we have to adapt to these. Let us help you adapt. If you agree to listen to us, if you work with us, then we will immunize, we will isolate, we will improve registration statistics. We will make possible whatever you need, and that is exactly what happened. In each state of India, this core idea was adapted, and therefore vaccination and isolation took place effectively, and that then underpinned successful smallpox eradication. So what does this then mean? It means that if we have to draw lessons from the smallpox eradication program that we can now consider during COVID, or consider, or in relation to any pandemic outbreak that in the future, we have to recognize that the lessons that are actually useful for each of these state level contexts and within district contexts inside each state, those lessons are not just available in the English language. Those lessons are also available in many languages. And when historians try to study nations and localities and study only English language files, I argue that they miss a lot. Why do they miss a lot? Because what I've learned from the papers that I've collected from the ground level, state level managers, is that many of their reports are actually written in local languages, in Marathi or Hindi or Bengali. Those daily field reports or weekly field reports are then translated into English so that WHO officials can read them. But in that act of translation from local languages to English, a lot of silencing is happening. Why is that silencing happening? Because certain things are politically not expedient. And therefore, it is very important. I always tell my PhD students to study not just the English translations of field reports, but also to read those reports in the original languages. So you can see what silences are being created. Those silences themselves tell you a lot. They tell you what India doesn't want others to know, or India thinks is not important. Translators have a lot of power, you see, and by not looking at field reports in major global health programs like smallpox eradication, historians are missing a trick. They are creating an artificial history of a top-down imposition of ideas for smallpox eradication. And that needs to be challenged, in my view. So that brings me to the issue of commemorations. So I argue right now, I submit to all of you that commemorative histories are also deeply politics, are deeply political, okay? So different pressures at different times impact on the content of publication. Let me give you an example. The photograph at the top here. In the middle is Margaret Chan, the Chinese lady, the lady from Hong Kong, from China, is Margaret Chan, then Director General of WHO. This was a picture taken in the 10 years ago, at the 30th anniversary of smallpox eradication. If you're facing the picture, to her right is Donald A. Henderson, whose hand she is holding. To her left is Havdan Mahler, whose hand she is holding. They're facing a statue that was developed and has been placed outside the WHO headquarters to commemorate smallpox. Everyone is smiling, everyone is happy. What is this picture intended to tell us? This picture is intended to tell us that everyone was happy, everyone cooperated. The cooperation of this international organization made smallpox eradication possible, okay? This photo has a purpose. If you do not study the unpublished materials from the 60s and 70s, then you cannot question this photograph. Because this photograph itself is trying to recreate a new history of smallpox eradication, of friendliness and happiness. But if you go back to the files, what you will find is that Henderson and Mahler often did not speak to each other. They fought each other. Okay? And because they fought each other, that gave a very specific flavor to the global smallpox eradication program. And we have to understand these as historians if we want to be of use both to our countries and to our states, state administrations and national government. Why is this important? Because it is very important that nations understand the complexity of the WHO, the complexity of the politics within the WHO. This should, in my view, be core training for diplomats, not just British diplomats, but also diplomats, IFS, Indian Foreign Service officials. They should be aware of the complexities of the politics that goes on, because only then will they be able to outmaneuver those who want to impose their priorities on countries like India. So it is very, very important to understand global health politics, and that global health politics, I think, can be better understood, more easily understood, more complex understandings can be developed through critical historical analysis. So history is not just an academic discipline. It is a discipline that can be deployed, developed, and deployed to a country's benefit, internationally, in international relations, but also in relation to state governments. For example, I think it is very important to train the officials of Odisha state in the politics of the WHO. Why? Because a lot of WHO aid programs come to state level governments, and implementation happens at state level. So you have to know not just your enemy, but also your friends in complex ways, so that the government's interests are met. Without this understanding, it is highly likely that alliances of international officials who are serving someone else outside India will get their priorities met at the expense of the state government or the national government. So history has to be seen as a core part of international and global health politics. History has to be seen as useful in policy in the broadest sense at all times. So here I've given you sort of photos, images of three, two major books. One is the 1988 Institutional History of WHO, Smallpox and its Eradication. All I will say, because we're running out of time, is that I was very lucky to spend a lot of time in the WHO archives, and through my interviews with many people in India. So in the WHO archives, I saw drafts of this chapter, and then through the interviews I did in India, I got access to the drafts of the chapter that India had edited before sending back to WHO. And what is very striking is when you pick out this book, is actually all the edits suggested by different Indian officials, who were powerful officials in New Delhi and the state capitals, were actually implemented in the final version. It again shows you who's powerful here. It shows you that countries, member states, are incredibly powerful within WHO decision making. Basically, WHO could not publish its original version of the chapters. Each of the chapters of this book deals with a different region and a different national context. National governments were able to determine what appeared in this book. So do not just read a book uncritically. Again and again, I'm saying this. It is very important to understand how these institutional histories are put together. This other book, Smallpox, the Death of a Disease, whose cover I put, is Donald Henderson's private memoir just before he died. And what is very striking to me is how the chapterization, how the narrative, the historical narrative of where it started, where things happened, is very different from the big red book. So if you want to understand just, potted critical history of smallpox eradication, just pick up these two books and compare them. The chapterization, but also what is being said in them. They are very different. And yet, Donald Henderson is an author in both books. What does this tell you? That when he is an author on behalf of the WHO, he's saying something else. But when he is a retired official writing his memoirs, he's saying something else. He's free. He feels much more free when he's writing his memoirs than when he was writing the big institutional official history. So these are important historical methods that I think historians have to remember. And it's through such criticality that I argue that you can recover the many silence histories. I had submitted to you that it was important. So I've already told you that I think one of the big gaps is that we do not have state-level histories in India about the Indian smallpox eradication program. Those are needed. I mean, I couldn't do what I did in relation to, Rajasthan and Bihar in Orissa because I didn't have access to your wonderful language. But, historians of Odisha can come together to do this. Equally, I think there are big gaps to understanding what the Soviet Union did. The few references to the Soviet Union actually are based on American sources reporting on Russia rather than what Russia is saying about itself and the world. There are gaps about China. I have a PhD student writing the history of the Chinese Eradicate program, which is eye-opening, absolutely eye-opening. Like the Indian program, completely novel. There's some work on Brazil, much more is needed. There's no work on Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, Iran, Somalia, Ethiopia. These are all massive gaps in global health histories. A lot more work needs to be done about what the Eastern Mediterranean, Southeast Asian, and European regional offices are doing in collaboration with each other. Again, because the focus is on Geneva, often what is happening in these regional offices is not studied. So again, if you study all this, if you draw out all these voices, many silence histories, I submit to you that such global health history then allows you to understand and cope with the great diversities that you need to adapt to succeed. Complex history allows for complex policy. Complex history allows for proper understanding of social and political complexity and cultural complexity. Once you understand social, political, and cultural variation and complexity, then it is easier for you then to design effective policy for those contexts. Top-down imposition through shouting, through force, works in the short term. In the long term, it creates resistance and weakens health systems. You lose the trust, the very trust that you need for successful health policy by using too much force. Health is always consultative. The patient, the target of vaccination, often teaches the vaccinator a lot. Therefore, historians have a role to find out what those interactions were at the local level, at the state level, in order to then record those narratives and offer it to our colleagues in WHO so that they can understand India better and India's variations better. So, having said all of this, it then brings us to my final slide that, what does the history or complex history of global smallpox eradication tell us about studying pandemics? Now, there is no doubt that successful smallpox eradication helped strengthen existing programs. For example, the expanded program on immunization, for instance, which was often competing, struggling for funds in the WHO headquarters and the regional offices, suddenly got a lot more donations. They were strengthened much more, basically because, once you'd eradicated a dangerous, deadly, fearsome disease like smallpox, you could then make a case for greater money to be given for vaccines against other diseases. So there is no doubt that the expanded program on immunization benefited from smallpox immunization at international, at national levels, and also the regional offices. But it was also very striking to remember that histories of the success of smallpox eradication, very specific institutional histories of the success of smallpox eradication, helped other eradication programs to develop in the 1980s and 1990s. And here I give you two examples. Now, this is a book that we published in our New Perspectives in South Asian History series by William Muraskin. He calls himself Bill Muraskin. I call him Bill Muraskin, on polio eradication and its discontents. And it's not a very expensive book. But here is a nice critical study of how the polio eradication program was started. I would recommend this to you if you want to study the sort of impact of post-smallpox eradication success, histories of success. And then picture to the right is a picture of a patient from whose foot guinea worm is being pulled out. You know, these are long worms that infect and make people very ill and make them unable to work, and of course creates disability, which is why the guinea worm eradication program started. And both polio and guinea worm are still not eradicated, as they've been in the so-called final inch for a very long time. But both these programs benefited ideologically from the smallpox eradication program's institutional histories. What do I mean by that? Many CDC officials who were involved in smallpox eradication programs, whose roles were highlighted in the CDC institutional history, then went on to play leadership roles in both these programs by using those institutional histories as justifications. Why am I highlighting this to you? Because I would like to argue to you that because, for whatever reason, such institutional histories were not written in India, India forgot about the very people who made smallpox eradication possible in a complex country like India. Therefore, Indian officials were not given leadership roles in future pandemic programs like polio and guinea worm, at least when they started. When polio started failing, because the artificial history could not really prepare the polio workers for the challenges that lay in India, India only succeeded when ultimately, after wasting a lot of time, they realized that they had to involve large numbers of national actors who could bring in contextual information about India. That's when the Indian polio eradication program worked, and India has eliminated polio successfully. So I would like to argue that if there had been a critical, complex global health histories of smallpox eradication, informing the people who set up the polio eradication program in India, they would have quickly understood the need to draw in state and district level leaders, and then, more importantly, listen to them and use their experience. So, I would argue that it's equally relevant now as we consider the situation in relation to the COVID pandemic to think critically about how smallpox was eradicated in each of the states. What were the structures that were useful? What were the social relations that were useful? What were the cultural understandings that were useful? What were the economic negotiations that were useful? Those histories, which were only 40 years ago, will actually help us prepare. We often forget that many of these people who were saved from smallpox are just 40 years old. They're still there. The parents of these people who are saved are now grandparents in some cases, but they're around. These are recent histories that I think have continuing relevance to this day. And therefore, I just want to end by asking all of you, and I can see that there are more than 70 people online today, and I'm very grateful to all of you. And I ask you all, is a living, inclusive history with multiple voices possible and useful in relation to any health program but especially in relation to COVID-19? Is it, in your view, possible? So thank you very much, everyone, for your patience. And I'll take a few questions
Yeah.
before we wind up. Thank you very much, Chandi.
Thank you. Thank you, Sanjay, for this brilliant elaboration of the issues that we are confronting today. In fact, I mean, look at this architecture of this talk. I was not. I didn't have a very thorough look at it in the slides in the beginning, but now the way it, the talk passed on, what I realize that what Sanjay is trying to, as he has been doing it for a long time, is talking about institutional histories, where you see that he's trying to persuade us. He has been saying that he's trying to argue out a position for all of us, and particularly it is important as students of history, as students of social science, as critical students of social science and history, to what kind of history we really need to look for, whether it has to be a history of few, or a history of many, or history of millions, or history of the silenced or the repressed. And as a medic, as somebody who is trying to look at or dig at the history of health and medicine, what kind of archives he has to look for. He talked about how the voices of these people, those who have been involved in this eradication drive, whether it is smallpox, whether it is TB, whether it is polio, these experiences, these views have not been recorded for many regions, for many localities. So it's trying to argue in terms of both the global history as well as a local history. So I mean, I'm reminded of this famous observation by Michel Foucault, who says that what we need today is to write effective histories. That is what is we need to look at. And particularly if COVID-19 kind of situation, when we are in a kind of pandemic like this, as historians, as social scientists, the best way to engage with this moment is to think of our own discipline, of our vocation. I mean, suddenly there is, it appears to me that since March, we have not been able to think through our own discipline. I mean, for example, there is a kind of national amnesia. As you rightly pointed out, that is just 40 years. We don't remember our history. The way India eradicated, India was did its bit in trying to eradicate smallpox. The massive experiences, the massive insights which came from the grassroots can be very effectively used, can be very gainfully used to deal with these situations. Is there to deal with this pandemic situation, to deal with COVID-19 situation? We not only look at only top-down approach or whatever advisory is coming from ICMR or WHO, but at the same time, we need to also look back to our own histories, where how people, at that point of time, the powers that be, they tried to deal with this situation in terms of developing a health structure, healthcare policy, everything. So this is what makes this moment very interesting, challenging, that we need to think about a narrative instead of just trying to latch on to what has already been said in terms of institutional history. And I think historians, I think scholars, those who are working on health histories, need to think about it. One of the major engagement, for example, for people doing history, for them, COVID-19 offers a kind of way out. They need, more and more number of scholars and people need to think about these kind of health histories, institutional histories, where they can bring back the voices, the kind of insights which have gone into the making of these eradication programs. And these could be really relevant and helpful in coping with the situation that we're in. Instead of getting into a mood of despondency, getting a mood of frustration, disillusionment, we need to bring back these ideas and percolate or try to disseminate these ideas into larger public domains, so that there is a greater awareness of what to do and how policy strategy can be crafted and governance can be more, effectively fine-tuned, so that the governments at the local level, regional level, national level can deal with the situation more effectively. I think some of the very interesting observations that he made in the course of his talk, and it's not only a talk, it's some of the convictions that he was sharing. It's not just something he read. His deep involvement, his intimate association with a domain called health history, and particularly not only health history concerning South Asia, but global histories. He has looked at the medical archives, whether it is in the WHO archives and almost many archives, medical archives of different countries. And through these, by exploring these archives and by structuring some of these very powerful ideas on specific issues that he has, his work on smallpox has been made more relevant today, that we need to think about it very seriously. And we're grateful to him that he found, at least despite all his personal preoccupation, and he's immensely busy because he is one of these advisors for the WHO and also for different countries, trying to craft policies, help people crafting policies. I hope that at least Indian government at one point or the other would also like to seek opinion from him, seek support from him in different ways. And I'm just, and the final point that I would like to make, that I was in the course of trying to deal with this COVID-19 in April and May. One of this person in Orissa is Mr. Raut, who was very seriously involved in polio eradication campaign. He was making this point very clearly, that it is time that we need to bring in these people, those who are alive, still alive, and who are very seriously involved in trying to deal with polio program. They need to be roped in to help us in at least dealing with this situation of COVID-19. I think this makes a lot of sense. And for example, as you rightly pointed out, for Orissa, these health histories at the local level has not been possible. I mean, we have not developed, or we have not come up with narratives about health histories of our own region, of our own localities. And these voices need to be somehow listened to, somehow need to be brought in to the narratives of the books, so that at least this can help the regional governments and the state governments to forge the strategies to deal with the situation more effectively. Thank you very much, Sanjay, for giving us some time. And at least I'm sure that I was looking at this chat box, and particularly I also take this opportunity to share with the viewers that Sri Bhattacharya Mata, Honorable Member of Parliament from Cuttack, was also present, and he was looking forward to Sanjay's talk. So I'm sure that he must have got a feel of what you are trying to say, and maybe in appropriate fora, you will try to share your concerns, share your ideas, share your advice to not only to the students of history. I understand you talked about repeatedly about history, but it's social science also, and people across from across the disciplines need to take away this particular message, that this is a time when we need to think about developing or writing health histories. So because we have a kind of theme for this webinar series called Writing Post-Pandemic Life World, I think one of the major component would be to focus more on writing health histories from a very micro standpoint and from a absolutely regional, local standpoints. So that could be a very interesting way out, and at least we can look forward to these engagements more seriously and critically. Thank you very much, Sanjay. We look forward to more bonding and more of such occasions when you talk to us and we also discuss some of the ideas. So now this is time that we have plenty of questions, so many questions. So I now request Neha to come up with select few questions so that Sanjay can at least try to have his own observations on those questions.
Good evening, sir. Professor Sanjoy Bhattacharya, sir. Thank you very much for your very elaborate, very beautiful presentation. And there are a lot of questions, and I'm reading you few. The first question is I'm taking of our honorable member of parliament, Sri Bhattacharya Mehtab sir has asked. He asked that talking about the recent happenings need a specific time gap so that history records issues and dispassionately and from a neutral platform. Uh, What should be this time gap? The second question is from PK Roy that South Asian played a crucial role in eradication of smallpox, but in current pandemic, India alone played a vital role in the isolation. That because he marked that many South Asian neighbors they are basically aligned with the prime movers of the current COVID pandemic. The another important question which Mr. Ghanesham has asked that if the social scientist opinion gone against the ruling party, how can be the ruling government will adopt that policy? Like you have also talked about Mr. Henderson that his post-retirement phase, the writing of he wrote many things after the retirement. So that question should the another question that what are the from Mahendra Kumar Das that what are the lessons we have learned from this smallpox and other epidemics which can be useful during the COVID-19 pandemic particularly, and how another question is Jayanti Sahu has asked that how can with this idea of eradication of smallpox can be relevant in the tackling the present pandemic because the its smallpox issues has been 40 years back, but now there the challenges are new. There are many challenges which is particularly related to this pandemic only. So these are the questions, sir.
Neha, could you please repeat the first question of Honorable Member of Parliament?
Yes, sir. He asked that talking about recent happenings need a specific time gap so that history record issues dispassionately and from a neutral platform. What should be the time gap of for writing such kind of history?
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that wonderful question, sir. So, I'm one of those historians who treats last week as history. So the gap doesn't need to be very much. So there are two things at play here. One is history writing and one is history material production. So the history material production can be immediate. Okay? And that history material production can be done on the basis of creating lists of people who are playing an important role, let's say in Odisha state. Creating a map of who's in charge of state level work against COVID, who's doing work at district level work, so that, once this crisis is over and people have more time, then that list is there for historians to then go to each of these people and interview them. So I agree with you that, it has to be dispassionate. It has to be non-political. And during pandemic, something very important is that everyone's life is in threat. So unless we work together across political ideologies and political divides, we will not be able to save society. So I think pandemics give an opportunity for international and national collaboration. I mean, if we have to see smallpox, a lot of people have said that, Cold War tensions were reduced because of smallpox eradication program. Soviet officials and American officials for the first time collaborated on the ground in different countries, forgot their different ideologies to make sure that smallpox was defeated. I think similar alliances, cross-political alliances, cross-party alliances will be needed in every country of the world if COVID is to be divided. Because if there's political division, only the virus will win. We have to protect the people. So I think that is my thing. But what is very important is perhaps a historian like Chandi or him and several of his colleagues beginning to work with Orissa government right now, or with the local legislature right now, creating a map of who's doing what the names are, who the people are, from state level right to district level to subdivisional level. Once you have that map, then you have created the true architecture of what the structure of the COVID response is, and then you start interviewing people. But I agree, Chandi, I think it's very, very important to identify all the local workers and contributors to the polio eradication program and interview them right now, because their experience, because it is even more recent than smallpox, will be crucial, because they have created social negotiations and political negotiations and bridges, cross-party, cross-political, non-ideological health work. Those lessons are going to be immensely important to Orissa government going forward with COVID response. I think the second question was, what was India's role in what are the lessons in relation to India's role in the smallpox eradication program? Am I right, Neha?
Sir, yes, the question was the South Asian, in contrary to the India, the other South Asian nations are prime movers for COVID-19, while India is alone in that war against the COVID-19. The question was from P.K. Roy.
Yeah, I again, disease knows no boundaries. So even at the height of, in the 1960s, I mean, the best example I can think of is when Bangladesh was East Pakistan, and there were political and military tensions between India and Pakistan, and there were wars, of course. But when there was a cholera pandemic, the health managers both in India and Pakistan decided that they had to have a ceasefire anti-cholera movement. Because if they didn't have a ceasefire anti-cholera movement, then the cholera would become worse both in Pakistan and in India. So there was actually a sense that the guns stopped firing and people were vaccinated. So often, diseases create prospect for peace. And if India is leading in the region, India can create peace with its neighbors by saying that, maybe this is a time for collaboration during the COVID-19 crisis. So yes, I think India is richer than many of the regional countries. But India also has historically always played a leadership and enabling role, a collaborative role, which I don't think we should ever forget. Especially at a time of such a crisis when we know so little about this terrible virus. Then the third question was about social scientists and the biases.
If the opinion go against the ruling party. For example, in China, many doctors will died. If the present government also, there are a lot of policy which will be going against the ruling party. What will the decision? What will the government? Is he going to allow this adopt the policies? This was the question.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about
which you told in Henderson.
Yes. So I think the role a historian has to play is to examine the wide variation in opinion that exists in administrative and social circles about the disease. That is the role the historian has to play. I don't think the historian necessarily has to play the role of what is right and what is wrong. The role of the historian is to describe in the widest possible complexity and richness of the multiple views that exist about a pandemic and its crisis. So how does that help policymakers? So that when policymakers from, let's say, Delhi or from Geneva or WHO are coming to try and help with the pandemic response, they are aware of the multiple social and administrative understandings of what is happening, so that they can answer doubts, help people clarify their protocols, and things. But I do understand. I'm not being naive about the question. I'm not trying to evade the question. I fully appreciate the question that sometimes history becomes political. But I think the argument I was trying to make is that if we can make it less political and more representative of the complexity that exists on the ground, then the complex history is more helpful than a narrow political history. Because a narrow political history will silence 5 views and represent 5 views. But in pandemic response, you need all 10 views to understand how your policy has to adapt in 10 ways to deal with the pandemic, if I make myself clear.
Yeah.
Then point 4 was about lessons. Question 4.
Sir,
Can you just
the
repeat?
lessons, what are the lessons we have learned from the smallpox and other epidemics which can be useful during this pandemic, and how can this idea of eradication of smallpox can be relevant for the tackling of problem of this pandemic COVID crisis?
Yeah, so basically, I think my understanding, we have to use the smallpox example for the COVID example, is that there are multiple social and administrative understandings of disease. So rather than creating a hierarchy of what is right and what is wrong, programmatically, policy-wise, right now the WHO has no idea what the multiple understandings of the disease are on the ground. What are the social and economic conditions that exist in the localities that make it difficult to social distance? What are the difficulties, for instance, in creating a sort of humane food distribution system that makes sure that the poor are not starving and they are not forced out of their house and break social distancing? So that sort of interviewing, that sort of study, I think would be very useful. That's what smallpox tells us. Hundreds of thousands of people were isolated during the smallpox eradication program. But that isolation was done, A, in a planned way, and B, in a humane way. Yes, there was a policeman in front of people's houses who had smallpox and they were isolating. But the state administrations were also making sure that food was reaching them, and they were not cut off completely from society. It was that humanity that meant that populations started working collaboratively with the WHO initiative. In fact, where food would not reach, if someone was being isolated, that is when people would try to break isolation and escape from their houses to try and access food. Food is a basic necessity. So that is, I think, one of the major lessons, that as India goes forward with COVID, anti-COVID work, India will have to develop, every country, not just India, every country in the world has to start planning and developing effective isolation program. Why are we testing? To identify cases. What do we do with those identified positive cases? We have to isolate them so that they don't infect more people. But that is not enough. It's not enough to say, go and isolate yourself. We have to then make it possible for them to isolate. And we make it possible for them to isolate people who are yet not infected. See that a government is helping, then they will become supportive of government. And if they become infected, then they will not try to hide their infection, but collaborate with government and report to government, sir, I think I'm falling ill. Right now, if people are scared, They will not tell the people that, look, I have fever, I have a headache, I can't smell, I can't taste, all signs of COVID. So trust is very important, and trust comes from careful planning. So that, I think, is my lesson from smallpox eradication about that aspect of COVID-19 planning.
Fantastic, fantastic.
Sir, if you will allow me, I will ask a simple question, so a small question. Sir, the culture of blaming during this pandemic was very high. The America blame WHO, and China blame USA. The Indian political parties blame each other. So besides coming with the some strategy and the plan, this became the agenda, social agenda, economy, and the religious agenda, and this was main priority for everyone. Even it is a narrow point of view, but then also it was there. So how you look at as a health historian, that what should be uh, the intellectual level or the mindset of these people, the policymaker, the government, besides this
Well,
blaming?
I started with that discussion of what is the WHO. So the people who say that WHO was listening to China forget that there's a regional office near China. So, you know, when Trump is accusing people, WHO being close to China, he doesn't seem to have any understanding of the complexity of the WHO. It is the role of the WHO to talk to every national government. So, you know, WHO talking to China is part of its official function. So the problem is that when you have a political accusation without an understanding of what the WHO's functions are, then you have a problem, because WHO talks to every nation. WHO was also talking to the US government. WHO was also talking to the UK government. WHO was also talking to the Indian government, the Pakistani government, the Bangladeshi government through its regional offices. So, I mean, again, I'll also go back to something else I said. International global health is always political. Health is political at an international stage because it relates to AIDS, it relates to political power. Every country is trying to dominate. So previously we had Russia and the Soviet Union. Now we have America and China. So basically what we are now going to see is countries dividing upon the alliances. So I think it's a very good idea that the WHO has now created a committee that will look independently at this issue. But I think they have to make sure that the committee really does work independently. And these two leaders, one from Africa and one from New Zealand, who are going to head the independent investigation panel, should declare all their interests transparently. We should also know how they were nominated, who nominated them. All that evidence is not out. And unless that evidence is out, the politicians who are making accusations against WHO will never trust the WHO. So for trust building, whether at an international or a global or a national level, transparency will be key, because a lot of people will die. So so courageous leadership, I think, is the need of the hour at any level right now. And anyone who tries to hide will not be able to hide, because the level of death will be so high that information will come out. So rather than information coming out, a courageous leader will help information to be collected and considered dispassionately and fairly. And this, I think, is important at global, international, or national, or state level in India as well.
Yes.
And this is very important for the Prime Minister of the country where I'm sitting, who is constantly running away from information. So Boris Johnson at some point has to acknowledge that there is information that he has to think about very carefully. So this is not just an Asian problem. This is a global problem.
Thank you. Yeah, that's absolutely.
I think I have to go now because
Thank you very much. I mean, we're so grateful to you.
Yeah, I have another appointment.
Yeah, I know. So we're cutting into your time, quality time. So thank you very much. We'll keep in touch.
Thank you for the questions, all thought-provoking. The one people people who want to ask me questions can email me their questions, and I
we are going to send you all these questions also. Manish will send you, and also all the feedback, and they're having everyone is having your mail ID. So I'm sure that they're going to, trouble you. They're going to bombard you with so many questions.
Yeah, and we published an article about how WHO Global Health History Project was born. It's open access. I'll send you the link. So if you can share it with all the attendees, maybe
We'll do that.
Interesting. How to create links between history and policy. So
Yeah,
maybe
at the end of the series also we're picking up all the important questions which can be shared to all the speakers, so that they can come up with that, so we can at least put it into a kind of proceeding now later on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Chandi.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Neha, for your help.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.